where most people do strategy a little bit, but there's always room to move and always new things we can do. And some organisations, maybe 10% of organisations, are not doing strategy very well and have some challenges there. Sometimes I think that's a bit of an underestimation. Lots of organisations have a lot to learn there. Okay, let me kick start. Given I've held you up and some of the technology has held us up, let me keep going. I want to start the presentation, if I may, by telling you a story. And this is a story that involves my youngest daughter and my wife and I deciding who was going to teach her to drive a car. And we drew straws, you know, we tossed a coin to see who would do it, and I lost the toss. And so I was given the job of teaching my daughter to drive. And it became very clear after 2 or 3 lessons that if I was to have a good long-term relationship with my daughter, I needed to outsource this job because it wasn't going to work well if I continued to do this. So we hired a local driving school to teach my daughter to drive. And after a few lessons, I spoke to the driving instructor, and I asked the driving instructor what I thought was a low-key question, but it turned out to be a very profound question. The question I asked was, is there one characteristic that distinguishes the experienced driver from the novice driver? And that one characteristic was how far they look down the road. So inexperienced drivers are inside the car. They're on the steering wheel, they're on the brakes, they are 5 or 10 meters in front of the car. Experienced drivers, probably like most of the people on this webinar today, look a lot further down the road. They look 100 meters, 200 meters, maybe even 500 meters down the road. And they notice the child playing on the side of the road. They notice the pothole on the road. They notice the dark clouds on the horizon. And they're looking ahead at things that they don't have to react to them all, but they might react to some of them and have to be ready for those things. They might sense there's a shortcut that they could take, or that they might deviate from their usual route because of things on the road. And the reason why I tell the story, because I think it's a very good analogy for what strategy is. Strategy is the art of lifting our eyes a bit, looking a bit further down the road and trying to anticipate what's coming ahead of us and seeing if we can respond to those things that are coming ahead of us. Most people, especially people at junior levels in organizations, are very operational and almost looking down at their desk or down at their piece of plant or equipment that they're working on. Those people who are good at strategy can lift their eyes, lift their vision, and look a little further down the road. And it's that skill, it's that expertise that we're going to be talking a bit about today in terms of strategy. So I want to, as Mildred mentioned in the introduction, I want to talk to you a bit about the purpose of strategy. I want to expose you to 6 different models of strategy very quickly, but encourage you to explore them a bit further and do a bit of a search and find out some more about them. Give you some thoughts about how you might choose the best model for you and for your organization, and also dispel some of the myths around strategy, because there's lots of them, and hence my introduction about it being a very messy art. So let me give you a couple of quick examples of interesting strategy. The first one involves the American airline industry at about the time of deregulation in the US. What the airline industry discovered was that when people go to book a flight with a travel agent, about 70 to 90% travel agent pulls up. So you go in and you say, I would like to fly from Kuala Lumpur to New York. And the travel agent types in those 2 starting point and the destination, And about 70 to 90% of the bookings are done on that first screen. About 50% of those bookings were done on the first line. So the very first item that pops up, the very first option that pops up was the one the travel agent picked and the one that the customer took. So the airline industry, particularly American Airlines, thought this was very interesting. So they also thought it was interesting that a lot of the bookings for airlines are done by small local travel agencies. So what American Airlines did at the time was they went to these small travel agencies and said, would you like us to give you a brand new computer? And of course, the small travel agencies said, yes, I'd love a brand new computer. Thank you, that would be great. And then they said, would you like us to give you some brand new software to go on that computer that will make it much easier for you to make all your bookings? And of course, they were small travel agencies, and they said, yes, that would be fantastic. Now, as you've probably already guessed, what American Airlines did with this software is made sure that all of their flights came up on the first screen, and as many as possible would come up on the first line on this software. So of course, business for American Airlines, particularly for their business travelers, jumped up enormously, and they had a fantastic boost in their number of bookings as a result of this strategy. Now, interestingly, what the other airlines did when they realized what was happening is they went to these small travel agencies and they said, would you like a new computer from us? And they said, no, thanks, I've got one. And so the strategy was very clever by American Airlines, because not only did they get a boost, but they also blocked many of their competitors from coming into the market and doing that. So it's a really good example of some strategic thinking, looking at the marketplace and looking down the road. This strategy cost them over $300 million, but it gave them a fantastic market share growth, a head start in what was to be the soon to be deregulated environment, and they got a whole raft of information on travelers, particularly business travelers. Now, the American airline regulators eventually, when they sensed what was happening here, jumped in and said that wasn't fair, that American Airlines were doing that. But by the time the regulators stepped in to do that, American Airlines already had a fantastic head start on the market and the way in which they would operate going forward. So that's a very big example of strategy at work. Let me give you a small one, which is equally relevant, equally important to illustrate what this thing about strategy is. In the life insurance industry, the average time it takes from somebody putting in a claim for a life insurance payment and them getting their money is 24 days. That's the average time. Many of the players in the industry thought they could get some competitive advantage and get some benefits if they could reduce that time and go to the marketplace and say, we will pay out on the life insurance faster than everybody else. So these companies did this, and they made some changes and they refined their processes, and they brought it down to 21 days, which was a small improvement, worth doing, but didn't make a radical difference to the industry. One organisation then came out and said, we'll do it in 4 days. A profound difference in the way in which they were able to pay on these life insurances. And you might think they did something radical, some really fancy thing here, but in reality, it was a very simple thing that they did. What they did was they followed the life insurance policy around the organisation for those 24 days. And they discovered that during those 24 days, that life insurance policy was only worked on for 17 minutes. The rest of the time, it was sitting in somebody's inbox, in transit, being delayed, being held up. So when they realized that how small this amount of time was, they were able to rethink their strategy and the way in which they did things to try and pare back the amount of time. Instead of spreading those 17 minutes over 24 days, they managed to spread it over only 4 days and make a significant difference and a significant statement to the marketplace about the way they did that. So the reason for telling that story, of course, is that strategy doesn't have to be a $300 million venture. It can be something that's relatively low cost, but still make a profound difference to the way in which we operate. So in essence, it's about changing our point of view, changing our vision from a very narrow perspective like this one to lifting our vision and taking a broader perspective on the marketplace, on the environment, on our organization, and the way in which we go forward. The other key ingredient as we start off here is, what is the strategic horizon for you? It used to be that we would take a 5 or a 10-year horizon, but it depends on the organization and depends on the industry. If you're in the forestry industry, for example, you might have a 25-year horizon, because that's how long it takes the plantation to go from seedling into a harvestable crop. In more recent times, with the arrival of COVID and the uncertainty about that, some of these strategic horizons have shrunk. And some organizations are saying, we're having difficulty looking a few months ahead, let alone a few years ahead. But as a general rule, 3 to 5 years is probably about the time horizon that most organizations would look at and try and plan and think through that issue around those horizons. Now, let's go on to talk a bit about the purpose of strategy. And I think there's 4 main purposes of strategy. The first one is direction setting. It says to the organization, this is the direction we're going, and it says where we're not going. So good strategy is about saying where we are going. It's also about saying where we're not going, because it's very easy to add things to the strategic objectives. It's very easy to pile more things on. Much harder for you to be courageous and say, we're going to stop doing that thing over there. We're going to take that away, and we're going to use those resources and redirect them into something else. So it's about pointing the organization and saying, this is exactly where we're going. The second purpose of strategy is decision making. It helps you decide what to do. Because if you're working on a project that's not aligned to the strategy, you should stop doing it. And again, that's hard. Sometimes the things we're doing are lots of fun, or they're very exciting, or it's brand new and it's shiny. But if it's not aligned to the strategy, it's not really contributing to the organization's success. So how will we decide? We go back to the strategy and saying, is this thing we're doing now underpinned by the strategy, and helping us make those decisions about where to use resources and where to position ourselves. Third purpose of strategy is confidence building. Very often in organizations, especially at lower levels in the organization, people get anxious about the ambiguity of not knowing where they're going. A good strategy helps to point the organization and helps to build confidence in the organization that the leaders of the organization know where they're going, know where they're taking the organization. And it's a very reassuring thing if there's a good, clear strategy that everybody can understand. And we'll talk about that understanding bit a little later on. Final purpose of strategy is about measurement and accountability. Strategy isn't just a warm, fuzzy thing that we do to keep our board happy, or because it says so in the management textbooks that we should have a strategy. It's all about measurement and making sure that we are clear and aware of what's required and holding people accountable for that strategy and the implementation of strategy. And on this particular purpose of strategy, I want to make a point about what's often described as the traffic light reporting systems. And you see these a lot in organizations when strategy documents are put together and people are reporting on how they're going against different measures. They use the traffic light system to say, we haven't got here, we've ticked off on this one, and we're on the way here. I think we have to be careful about these traffic light systems, because if every item on your traffic light is red, then the measures you've set are way too difficult. Obviously, that's a problem. Equally a problem, though, is every item is green, then the measures are way too easy. If every time those reporting systems come back and everybody's ticked green along the way, that may make everybody feel like they're on track, but it might say to you, maybe these measures aren't demanding enough or hard enough. A much better traffic light record might be a blend of colors. Some measures that we've tried really hard for, we're not quite there yet, so those are red. Others that we've put in place, we're having some success at those, and we've got these amber ones in the middle, which we're still trying to navigate and still trying to make our way through. So for me, those are useful things to remember in terms of what's the purpose here and what we're trying to achieve. So with that kind of quick introduction, I want to open it up and ask Mildred to field some questions just for a couple of minutes before we go on to talk about the different models in strategy.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Dr. Sean. I think that was a really concise introduction to what strategy is. And I really like what you said about, your strategy doesn't have to be American Airlines $300 million US strategy. Mm-hmm. And I think with that, we actually have some questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. Uh-huh. So a related question is from Mr. Harold Yumbang of UCAS, who says, he wants to learn how to be creative at simplifying his strategy. And I think this really goes back to what you mentioned about, the life insurance example. So yes, if you could give him some tips on how to be creative. And I think in the meantime, participants can put their questions in the chat box.
Yes, it's a really good question. And I'll talk a little later on about some examples of how you might simplify things. But I tried to illustrate this a little bit with my opening story, because if you go to the library or the bookshops and get books out on strategy, they're usually very thick and very heavy reading. And that, I would just wonder about the merits of that. Whereas in reality, strategy doesn't have to be that dense. It doesn't have to be that hard. And if you can translate your strategy into a story, into a message that everybody can connect with, if you can explain it in a way that's interesting and engaging, I think that goes a long way to helping this strategic process. I've seen some organizations which are hundreds of millions of dollars put their strategy to all of their staff on one A4 piece of paper. And again, you kind of go, well, is that too simplistic? Well, it depends what you're trying to do. If all you're trying to do here is to say, here's our mission, here's what we're trying to achieve, here are our key result areas, here are the measures that we're going to hold ourselves accountable for, maybe that's enough. And maybe you can capture that on a single piece of paper, and then operational plans and department plans and divisional plans can fall out of that in more detail. But the actual kind of key bits of the strategy, the key direction setting and confidence building could be on a very small piece of paper and be part of a broader story.
Yeah, definitely. I really like that tip about making sure that we understand the story and keeping it very simple on, a piece of document that everyone can follow. We also have a question from the chat box from Andrea Lim. Is Balanced Scorecard a good tool for strategy effectiveness measurement?
Aha, it's a really good question. And we're going to be talking about the Balanced Scorecard a little later on. I think the Balanced Scorecard is a really good model, but it's only one of many. It's not the only one. It stood the test of time, but it's only one of many, and it can be used really, really well and really, really badly. So the tool itself isn't the make or break for it, and won't guarantee success and won't guarantee failure, but it's just one of many tools. A good one, but one of many.
Yeah, Dr. Sean will be really excited to hear what you have to say about the balanced scorecard, because that's the system that we use
Yes.
in the state government. So I think we're on time. So I think I'll pass it back to you for the next poll and the next section. And
Right.
for the audience, feel free to post your questions. We'll get back to them in the next section. Thank you.
Okay. So let me then go on to looking at some of the models for formulating strategy. And I'm going to give you 6 models, all of which you can source from by going to Google and getting some more details on, with the exception of the first one, which is a more generic one. But again, these are 6 models, but 6 of many. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of models. So the first model I've called the stick in the sand model. And the reason why I called it this is that when we talked about strategy, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, what we used to do is we used to say, let's put a stick in the sand 10 years out from where we are now. And then we'll map back from there 9 years, 8 years, 7 years, 6 years, 5 years. And that's how we used to do strategy. We used to say, where do we want to be in 10 years' time? Put the stick in the ground then and map back from there. And that, in those days, was a very good model, except the only trouble now, of course, is the stick moves. The tide comes in and moves that stick, and the world's more volatile than that. But nevertheless, if your organization is relatively stable and the future is a bit more predictable, then maybe this model is still relevant for some organizations. Essentially, it has these 5 components to it. It starts with an environmental scan, the traditional SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, to get a bit of a picture of where the organization is now. Then it goes on to talk about vision and mission, as a way to identify what the purpose of the organization is, again, to get an overall view. And then it targets some key result areas. What are the important areas of the business that you want to focus on? Then some strategies underneath that to address those key result areas. And then a set of performance measures of how you might hold people accountable for achieving those strategies, achieving the key result areas, and ultimately achieving the vision or mission. So that's the stick in the sand model. As I say, quite a conservative one that works well in organizations that are pretty stable, but I think one that more volatile organizations or in more volatile marketplaces is being used less and less now. The second strategy is called the strengths-based model. And this one, in contrast to the stick in the sand one, this one says, let's not look at the things that we're weak at. Let's focus on the things we're really, really good at and get better at those things. And those of you who are in the HR part of your organizations will recognize that the move in the human resource development area has been towards a strengths-based model there as well. Same principles apply here in terms of a strengths-based model for organizations. And if you're going to look this one up, look up the acronym SOAR, S-O-A-R, because it's very commonly used now, and we'll give you some more detail on this. Again, it says, asks you to sit back and say, what are the things that we are really good at in our organization that we can build on? Now, those of you who follow sport will know that this is a tactic that's used in sport a lot. If you're a soccer fan, you'll know there's famous scoring soccer players like Cristiano Ronaldo, who is a fantastic centre forward, fantastic player, scores lots of goals, probably would be a terrible goalkeeper. So why would we get him to focus on being a good goalkeeper? Why wouldn't we focus him on being a very, very good centre forward and scoring lots of goals? So that's the principle here with the strengths-based model. Looking at what we're good at, looking for opportunities that arise from various stakeholders, aligning those to the aspirations, the values, the things we care deeply about, and then honing in on the results about how we deliver on those opportunities against those aspirations and using our strengths. So it's a different approach, it's a different mindset to how we might do this and get this moving forward. The third model comes from a guy called John Argenti, and this one has been around for a very long time and has been very successful and adopted by a lot of very big organizations in both the public and private sector. And it's a model that lends itself well to public sector agencies, not-for-profit organizations, as well as the big corporate sector organizations. Fundamentally, the model is around answering a number of really important questions and crucial questions. And here's a set of some of those sorts of questions. Asking yourself, for whose benefit does our organization exist? And you have to be careful about these sort of questions, because you can't say, well, the people who benefit from my organization are all the people of Sarawak. Although that might be true at the very end of the process, you need to be more specific about that and say, no, our organization is serving people who are between this age bracket, or people who have a particular disability, or people of a particular characteristic, to help you really narrow down what it is you're about. And then once you do that, what benefit do these people expect from us? How will they measure the volume of benefit that will deliver to them? And what performance level will be acceptable and unacceptable to them? It's a really interesting model, and one that requires a great deal of thought, but a powerful process and a powerful set of questions. And when you get the slide set, you'll see on the slide I've put the web address for the Argenti system, so that you'll get some more information about it there. Or there's a really good book called Practical Corporate Planning by John Argenti, which can talk you through the process as well. Well worthwhile, and a really interesting model and a thoughtful model as you go forward. The next model is called Blue Sky. And this one, in contrast to the stick in the sand one, this one is quite revolutionary. It's about a radical shift in strategy. If you're going to tip the organization upside down, then maybe the Blue Sky model is the one to think about. It's about thinking about scenario planning, and there's been lots of literature around what's often called blue ocean strategy. So this model asks you to think kind of really deeply about your organization and challenge all of the assumptions about the business and the way in which you do it, and the organization and the function of the organization. The blue ocean strategy really pushes you to think about what they describe as uncontested space. So although it talks in a highly competitive sense, as if you were a commercial organization, public sector agencies can do the same thing to say, you know, let's challenge what we do, let's break the mold, let's think again about the way we do things in our organization, and really test some scenarios, test our thinking about what we do and how we do it. This idea of breaking the value chain and having a system approach where you can differentiate what you do and still remain low cost, which in traditional strategic thinking has been a bit of a no-no. The view always was that you either had to be good or cheap. You couldn't be both. Now this blue ocean type strategy says, well, maybe you can be both. Maybe you can be good and cheap, or differentiated and cheap, if you don't have other competitors or other things going on in the marketplace, because you're the only people who are doing things in this particular way or thinking in this way. So again, in contrast to some of the other models, this one is quite a radical one and really challenges you to tip the organization upside down in a revolutionary way rather than an evolutionary way. Model number five is called Levers of Control, and comes from a guy called Robert Simons from the Harvard Business School, is where he was when he first developed this model. And this model is an interesting one because his view is that you have relatively few levers that you can pull in an organization from a strategic perspective. If you start from the top left-hand corner, the belief systems, the core values of the organization should underpin that strategy. And then you move to some what he describes as critical performance variables, which are the key performance measures. What are the really few things that are most important to you from a performance perspective and really drive the accountability around those items? Then you have a set of what he describes as strategic uncertainties. And again, in a COVID world, we have a whole host of strategic uncertainties and being alert to those. And the last one is an interesting one, this boundary system to say, what are the things we won't do? What are the risks we won't take? Where are the boundaries here for the way in which we do things? And it's, again, a really interesting model, a slightly more technical one, but an interesting one nevertheless for you to explore and think more about and how it might fit for your organization. And it also has a focus on internal controls to make sure that this thing is aligned to your overall position and what you're trying to do, and your internal control systems support that. The last of the models, we come back to the balanced scorecard, which one of your questions was about. This one comes from a guy called Robert Kaplan, again a famous Harvard Business School professor, and has been around probably for almost 30 years now, 25 or 30 years. Excuse me, and has been a very successful model for a lot of organizations. The organizations that do it well are the ones that are able to drive the objectives and the measures and the targets and the initiatives and have them all lined up and aligned effectively around the organization's overall vision and overall strategy. Again, just because you have a balanced scorecard doesn't mean you'll be successful. It is quite a demanding and requires a lot of discipline. But for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it really picks up 4 areas of the organization and says you need a balance between these areas and you can't just rely on one of them. Typically organizations have a big emphasis on the financials and the way in which those financials appear to the shareholders and the stakeholders. But Robert Kaplan would suggest you need other areas, your internal business processes, how you satisfy customers' needs with those business processes and which of those you want to excel at. And again, in public sector agencies, this one becomes very important because you need to identify which of those processes are most important to you and how you might make those work for you and for your organization and for the stakeholders that you serve. The third area is on the customer or the client or the ratepayer or whoever it is for your organization, and how you might align those objectives, measures and targets against the customer profile and make those meaningful for customers. And the last area here you can see is all about the way in which you balance all of these things together and make it work for your organization and make it successful for your organization. So learning and growing in the organization is how you progress, how you adapt to change, how you're successful there. And if you can do that bit of it well, then the other 3 parts of this balanced scorecard become important. Again, a really good model, one that's used a lot throughout the world, but some organizations use it and do very, very well. Other organizations who use it don't do quite so well because it requires a lot of discipline and a lot of, excuse me, a lot of focus on those particular measures and make sure those measures work. Before going on a bit further, I just want to talk a bit about measures, because a common characteristic of all 6 of these models is the notion of measures and how these measures might work. So a quick look at how you choose the best model for your organization. And then I want to talk a bit about these measures before we go to another poll. So which is the best model for your organization? One question you might ask is, how volatile is your organization? If it's pretty stable, then maybe the stick in the sand model, maybe the Argenti model is the one for you. If it's highly volatile, highly turbulent, changing all the time, then maybe some of the more adventurous models, the SOAR model or the blue sky model might be a better one for you. The next dilemma might be, how complex is your organization? If you if you sell coffee and that's all you sell, and you have a little hole in the wall coffee shop, then maybe the complex, detailed, balanced scorecard type models are not the ones for you. If you are a big, complex organization, then maybe those more complex ones or more sophisticated models might be the one for you. Third criteria you might use for deciding which model is best for you is what your facilitator likes to use. And the reason why I emphasize this is our experience suggests that those organizations that succeed best in developing, implementing, communicating a strategy are ones that have a facilitator who guides them through that process. If you try to do it in-house, sometimes it can get messy, because if the facilitator is a member of the senior management team, then often they want to be part of the strategy discussion as well as the facilitator, and it's a very difficult position for them to be in. So let me go on to talk about these measures, because these are important. There's 4 types of measures, and they apply to all of the models that we've talked about so far. There are input measures, behavioral measures, output measures, and outcome measures. Ideally, you want to have more outcome measures than input measures, but often they're not within your control. So you might have to come back down the scale a bit. But let me give you a quick example of each of these. An input measure might be a measure that says, we will only recruit executives with a university degree. So we're going to ensure that everybody the measure is that everybody that joins our organization at an executive level has a university degree. Now, it's called an input measure because you are not doing anything about the quality of that employee. All you're asking is for some particular characteristics, and you're going to inject that in the hope that that will have a positive impact on your organization. No guarantees, but it's a measure, and you can see why it's a problem if you have too many of those input type measures. A behavioral measure is one, as the name suggests, asks you to measure specific behaviors. So you might say, all customers coming to our reception will be greeted with a smile, eye contact, and refreshments. So there's specific behaviors that you can say, I can measure that, I can observe that, I can evaluate that, those behaviors. So if you've got somebody in a role like that and you're struggling to set performance measures for them, maybe you need to focus on some performance measures that are behavioral. Output measures are things like the management report will be completed by the 30th of June. It's a very specific measure. You can tell whether it's done or not done. Again, it doesn't say anything about the quality of the report. It just says we produced it on time. It's an output measure, and again, helpful. It means that somebody's clear about the expectations of when this report is done, and it's a specific output. An outcome measure, though, is much more sophisticated. So this one might say, as an example, student performance in their final exams improved by at least 5%. So you can see why this one's an outcome measure, because there's a whole range of things that would need to have happened for that student performance to go up by 5%. And you're saying, well, how you get to that measure is really up to you. This is the outcome that we want from this thing here. And we want student performance to grow by 5%. And it's a different type of measure and a much more meaningful one, in the sense that you're most often trying to achieve those outcomes but very hard to do. And sometimes those outcome measures are hard to identify. So you have to retreat to some of the other performance measures along the way. So I hope that's helpful in terms of getting those performance measures in place. So I'm going to throw back to Keegan, who's going to run another poll with you and ask you to think about which of these models works best for your organisation and what might be getting in the way. So I'll throw back to Keegan if I can.
Yeah, Dr. Sean, Keegan has actually launched the survey and we can take a look at the results. Are you able to see the results?
I can see them. I can see that everybody loves the balanced scorecard.
No surprises there.
It would be interesting to see the organisations and the people who chose the blue sky model, because there's 10% of people who have gone for that one. So that's probably the most radical one, and that will be the most challenging, particularly in a public sector organisations, to really tip the organisation upside down. And the things that get in the way, the biggest barriers there, that is interesting as well. Explaining the strategy in terms that everyone can understand. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next segment. Holding people accountable, again, a very common reason for people having difficulty implementing strategy. So no, interesting that, you know, despite the distance between us in geographic terms, the outcomes of those surveys are actually very similar to how they would appear here in Australia and elsewhere in the world. So we all have the same challenges and the same problems, unfortunately. Okay, Mildred, do you want to open up to some more questions before I do the last bit?
Yeah, Dr. Sean, we have a live question from Andrea Lim. Andrea, if you can just show on your video and go on unmute. I think there was also a few questions asked regarding, you know, how do you implement strategy in a bureaucracy when you have, or maybe we'll go to Douglas' question first. So Douglas Tang asked, you know, although there's a common strategy within an organization, how does one integrate the organizational strategy within the context of a department with differing roles and different technical expertise?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we often hear that in organisations that are big and quite diverse. The challenge really for that question goes back to the senior team who are putting the overarching strategy in place, the umbrella strategy, because that umbrella strategy has to pick up all parts of the organisation. Otherwise, as I mentioned earlier, you might have people who are doing things that are not under that overall umbrella. And frankly, that wastes resources, that diverts resources and people and energy away from that overarching strategy. So it puts the pressure on the top level executives to make sure that the overarching strategy picks up all of the business. And if it doesn't pick up all of the organisation, then it needs to be courageous enough to say, okay, we're going to stop doing that thing that's over there and redirect those resources to the things that are under that umbrella strategy. And then for each team, each division within that department or within that overall organisation, they need to then frame their operational plan in the light of the overarching strategy to say, what's our contribution to that overarching strategy? How are we contributing and making our part towards the whole organisation achieving that? And that requires, again, some discipline and some hard decisions sometimes about, you know, what are we doing? How do we make the best contribution to support the overall organisation strategy, rather than just keep doing what we've always done, which may or may not help the overall organisation or may not align. So there's no simple answer. It's just a really disciplined approach, unfortunately.
Good morning, Dr. Sean. So I'm Andrea here. So if you can share with us, how would I be able to sell my department strategies in a very public sector that is, how do I go through all the bureaucracy? How do I sell? How do I convince? How do I go through this bureaucracy? I'm not sure whether you have a way in the public sector in Australia, if you could share with us. Thanks.
I don't have a magic bullet, unfortunately. I don't have a fantastic solution for you. Whenever we talk about this issue, when we ask senior people about this issue, they often tell us that they are much more open to people presenting their strategy and getting their strategy over the line if it's framed in language that reflects the overarching strategy. So a bit like the answer to the previous question, it's not describing what you do, but describing what you do and how that makes a contribution to the bigger picture. So that sell is much easier if you're helping your boss achieve his or her objectives and helping them support their boss up the organization. So it's how is our team making a contribution overall? So if it's framed in that way, it ceases to be you fighting against somebody else for resources or visibility in the organization for your strategies. It's much more about here's how we can help you be successful. And people tend to be much more open to that when they feel like somebody's on their side and helping them be successful.
Definitely, I think that's a really great answer to how do you garner support for your strategy, right? So Dr. Sean, we have a question from Sirai Daha, who says, Blue Ocean strategy was very popular once. What strategy can be applied when the blue ocean turns red?
Your questioner is very astute. The Blue Ocean strategy was very popular, less popular now because it's a very radical position. And it requires a very courageous CEO and a very courageous team of people to pull it off because it's risky. It's risky for you to say, well, the 50-year history of this department, we're going to cast that aside and we're going to do it in a different way and a different model. It takes a very courageous person, and you would want to be pretty confident that you could bring that about before you embarked on that. So it's that high risk notion of Blue Ocean strategy that makes people nervous about it and sometimes makes it less successful. Invariably, what people do when if that Blue Ocean strategy doesn't work is they revert to one of the much more conservative models. They flip into, an Argenti type model or even a balanced scorecard one, which is again a very disciplined one, and hope that will rewrite the ship and rebalance the ship and bring things back into some sort of stability if they haven't broken the organization permanently. If Blue Ocean goes well, it's fantastic. If it goes badly, it can be catastrophic. So it's high risk, high gain, but as I say, if that doesn't work, people flip to something much more conservative.
Yeah, definitely. Next, Dr. Sean, we have a question from Julia Clifton. May I know your opinion on the change management strategies or approaches during times of uncertainty, and very aptly, for example, in a time of COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, there has been a lot written about this, and we're learning a lot about how people respond in times of great uncertainty around here. And the COVID situation worldwide has really forced this on most of us. And I think we won't really know for maybe a year or two exactly what impact this has had on us all from a resilience perspective, as well as an organizational level. But from what we've observed, the organizations that have coped best with this type of uncertainty are those that have good relationships with their staff and over communicate. They are talking to their staff constantly, reassuring them, engaging with them, talking with them, presenting to them, listening to them over and over and over again. And for people that thought they were doing it a lot before, they found they need to sort of double and triple the amount of communication they do, just because the way people are feeling, they're detached, they're working from home constantly, they're disconnected with all of their friendships, their relationships with work colleagues. All of those things are causing great anxiety. And as I say, the organisations that we've seen that have responded best to this are the ones that over-communicate.
Yeah, definitely, and making sure everyone is in on the plan forward.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question from the district office of the Telang Unsap. I think everyone is a little bit shy because when they ask the question, I asked if they would like to go live, and a lot are opting to say no. So I will ask on their behalf.
That's okay.
So the question is, to ensure organizational survival in this volatile and unstable environment, do you think hybrid strategies would be the way forward?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's unusual for any organisation to use any of the models I've presented, or other models for that situation, that they use them in a pure sense. It's unusual for them to do it in a pure way. They do it exactly sort of in a textbook way. Most organisations adapt and blend because they're different. The circumstances are different, the people are different, the skills are different, the circumstances are different. So yes, I would encourage a hybrid model regardless of the volatility in the marketplace, but especially in the current circumstance. I think we have to be agile and light on our feet with practically everything, including strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it always sounds wise to try and figure out what works best for the organization and, you know, sort of adapt and adopt from time to time. So I think that's all that we have for this session. So I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Sean.
All right, thank you. I want to finish up this presentation with 5 strategy myths. And these are ones that I hear often. And hopefully we can try and challenge some of those myths along the way. So the first one, and perhaps the most important one, is you often hear people say, we have a good strategy. And you only need to say one thing when somebody says that to you, and that is prove it. And of course you can't, because good strategy is only good strategy with the benefit of hindsight. It's not until we look back on our strategy that we can say, gee, that decision that we made 3 years ago was a really good decision, or that decision that we made 3 years ago was a really bad decision. It's only with hindsight that we can judge strategy. And that's why I kind of described it at the beginning about direction setting was about being approximately right and not precisely wrong. It's about adjusting our position and using our best judgment on the information that we have in front of us to make a decision about the direction we're going and the tactics and the strategies we're going to use to get there. Is it the right one? We think so. Can we be certain that it's the right one? Absolutely not. Especially in such a volatile environment as the one we're in now. We won't know whether we've got the right strategy until we've had 2 or 3 years to look back and go, yes, we made a good decision, or no, we didn't make a good decision. So, you know, you often hear people say, well, I want to keep working at this until I get the perfect strategy. It doesn't exist, and it certainly doesn't exist looking forward. It might be a good strategy looking backwards and saying, hey, we did that well. But looking forward, it's a guess, It's an educated guess, an informed guess, one that's built around some evidence and some data that you might have gathered, but you certainly can't guarantee that strategy is going to be successful in advance. It's only with the benefit of hindsight. The second of your myths is that all your staff care about your strategy. And this has come up in a couple of the questions, and this comes up quite often where people say, how do I get my staff to engage with the strategy? And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute or two. But often when people say to me, what's the ideal size group for a strategic planning session? And, you know, slightly facetiously, the ideal size group is a group of one. After that, it just gets complicated. And so organizations usually resort to a model that says, we're going to get the senior group of people together and we're going to have that group think great thoughts about what we're doing and come up with the strategy. The way I've seen it work, perhaps best of all in organizations, are organizations who take a diagonal slice through the organization and bring more people in on the conversation around strategy. It's about engaging more people, connecting with more people at different levels in the team. And further down the organization, you might pick up some of your young stars, some of the young people who have got some great ideas, who you have great aspirations for in the future. Bring them into some of the strategic planning conversations, the strategic planning meetings that you have. Get their input, get their insights, because they'll come from a different generation, they'll come from a different perspective in the organization, and they'll often have very good input and ideas that you can contribute into that mix. So I think that's a worthwhile strategy or worthwhile approach to go with, rather than just relying on the top, you know, most senior executives, or just putting it in the hands of one person. This diagonal slice, I think, is a good option. The next of the myths is that all your staff understand your strategy. And this came up a little earlier on. I think this is a really important ingredient. And I think most staff in most organizations don't understand their organization strategy. It's presented in a way that's too complex, and they don't connect with it, they don't understand it, they don't relate to it. So I think we need to work harder at how we might translate our strategy into a story or into a language that people can understand. So let me give you an example of that. Most often in organizations, they have some sort of mission statement or vision statement or purpose statement, which is, you know, often a convoluted set of words. It might be several paragraphs long, and most people don't know what it is. They don't read it. It's too detailed and it's too complex for them. But here's another way of doing that. So here's 2 tests for a good mission statement for you to test yourself out on. So a good mission statement, test number 1. If you take away the name of the organization, do you still recognize who it is? So if you look at your organization's mission statement, if you took off the name of your department or your division or your area, would people still recognize who it is? If they can't, maybe your mission statement is too generic and doesn't pick up the real uniqueness of your organization or your business. So let me give you an example. I'm going to show you a mission statement of an Australian organization, and I think you'll be able to guess who it is, even though I won't tell you the name of the organization. Okay, so here's me going out on a limb here, me testing this assumption to see whether you can guess who this organization is. Okay. To fight and win at sea is the mission statement of an Australian organization. To fight and win at sea. It's very short, it's very succinct. Everybody in that organization is in no doubt what the purpose of this organization is. Now, I hope that you may have guessed that this is the Australian Navy. Now, you may not like the mission statement. It's one that makes me a bit uneasy, but it's simple, it's clear, and you recognise who it is immediately. Everybody in Australia who sees that mission statement knows that belongs to the Australian Navy. So think about, excuse me, your mission statement. If you took off the name of your organisation, would people still recognise who it is? And can you capture that mission in a really short, sharp, succinct way so that every employee in your organisation and every one of your stakeholders knows exactly who your organisation is and who you're talking about? So that's test number one. Test number two is the one I call the Doona test. The Doona test goes something like, you're lying in bed on a really cold Monday morning. It's cold in bed, you're really tired, you've had a fantastic break, and the alarm goes off for you to get up and to go to work. And you reach out onto your table beside your bed and you pick up your organisation's mission statement, because that's where you leave it, and you read your organisation's mission statement. And the Doona test says, do you get up for that? Is this motivating enough to get you up out of bed and get you to work and say, you know what, that's a really good purpose. I'm connected to that. I'm engaged with that. I want to do that. I want to make that contribution. I'm getting up and I'm going to work. So that's the Doona test. And again, if you look at your mission statement, does it do that? Is it motivating? Is it engaging? Does it inspire people to say, hey, I'm proud to work for that organisation. I want to do this and I want to work for this organisation. So let me give you an example of one of these. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel in London. So again, if you work in this organisation, whether you clean the rooms, you stand at the front door, you're the chief executive, you work in marketing, you work in HR, you work in operations, they all have the same mission statement. And each morning they wake up and they go, I'm a lady or a gentleman on my way to serve ladies and gentlemen. And for people who work in that industry, that passes the Doona test. It passes the Doona test of something that's motivating, that gets people to work. Probably doesn't do so well on the first test of people recognising instantly it's the Ritz-Carlton, but it is an interesting example of one that can be highly motivating in the right industry. So myth number 4, big is best. And I've talked about this a few times already. If your strategic document is 150 pages of size 9 font typing, then it's probably not very good, because nobody's reading it. Certainly nobody beyond the people that actually put it together are reading it, and it's not connecting with the organisation. So think about how you might do less rather than more. If no one's reading it and it's not a living document, then what's the point? It just gets old and it gathers dust. You might meet some compliance requirements, you might tick a few boxes, but it doesn't engage the workforce, doesn't engage people in working hard for the organisation and knowing what it is they're trying to achieve along the way. The last of the myths is a good strategy will survive the test of time. A good strategy implemented at the right time will always be better than a brilliant strategy that misses a critical moment in the external environment. So again, you'll see people working really hard to try and come up with the perfect strategy or the brilliant strategy. And while they're doing that, they miss a key moment in the external environment. Whether, excuse me, whether it's something that's happening within the government, something that's happening within the community, some change that's happening out there, timing is important. So a good strategy that can be implemented is always better than a great strategy that can't. And we need to focus on that and make that a really important point for people to keep the strategy process moving so that it pitches a good strategy at the right moment along the way. This person you might recognize, he always has a great quote or two. And he says here, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. And I think that's a really important message to end on, that the strategy process, right at the start, I said it's a very messy strategy. Strategy can be very messy, it can be ambiguous, it can be challenging, and we won't know we'll be successful until a few years down the track. But keep focusing on the results, keep focusing on what it is you're trying to achieve, and work on that strategy as a living document and as a living process, rather than once a year, tick a box, put it on the shelf and carry on doing what you've always done. Strategy is a living process that brings results to the fore and is engaging for everyone. So that's it in terms of my input and my thoughts on this. I'm very happy to take some more questions. And as Mildred mentioned, I'm very happy to share the slides with you after the presentation as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sean, for that very insightful sort of 3 different sections. We do have some questions coming in. I just want to pick up one from the CEO of Leadership Institute, Tuan Haji Ismail, earlier, that sort of relates to your quote from Winston Churchill, right? So
Yes.
he says, like, generally corporate strategies fail because of execution. And then I think you captured it very clearly that a strategy is a living document that should evolve, right? But
Yes.
how should organizations think about, okay, now they have a beautiful piece of strategy, you know, how do they anticipate what problems may come up in execution?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a very common situation where the strategy fails at the implementation stage, not at the design stage. I think organizations spend way too little time on implementation. They might, spend hours, days, sometimes even months putting the strategy together, and then they just assume that it's going to be implemented. I think we need to put at least as much, if not, 2 or 3 times more time into implementation, identifying what are the things that might help us be successful and what are the barriers that will get in the way of us being successful, and having those conversations at a senior level and at an operational level throughout the life of the strategy itself. It can't be a one-off event and then assume that everybody's got it and it will roll out, because invariably it won't, regardless of which model you go for or how it works. So driving that implementation is going to take many, many more hours than the actual design of the strategy itself.
Yeah, definitely. And Dr. Sean, do you mind if you stop screen sharing? We will share the QR attendance code. And I think we have a few more minutes for any other questions from the audience. Oh, we can still see your screen, Dr. Sean.
Okay, let me just get rid of it.
Yeah. So I think we still have a couple of minutes for any questions from the audience regarding strategy. And if not, perhaps I can ask. So Dr. Sean, given your experience working with a lot of different organizations, are there any success stories of strategies that you've seen implemented by government organizations that you could perhaps share with us?
Yes, there are. There's some good examples. One relatively recent one here in Western Australia, we have a government department that looks at jobs, tourism, innovation and science. And they've developed a very clear strategy around Asian engagement. And this is a strategy that was driven by this one department and driven by the chief executive of this department, a lady called Rebecca Brown. And what was important about this strategy is once it was formulated with the support of the political arm of government, then it was rolled out across the other departments as well. So it wasn't just restricted to one department. It was one that was well documented, had the support of the commercial centre, the centres of Perth. So they engaged those commercial organisations in this Asian engagement strategy. And they put a very succinct document together that's available on their website. And that strategy now is being rolled out across government here in Western Australia. So that was one that was really interesting and good because it engaged lots of stakeholders, both political stakeholders, other government agencies, and also the for-profit sector in making sure that the strategy was aligned, everybody was on board with it, and then that made the implementation not easy, but simpler.
Yeah, sounds like if I can pick out the key points that you mentioned, Dr. Sean, that the strategy needs to be very, very clear, succinct, documented very, very well. And, it really needs the buy-in of all the stakeholders that are involved. And finally needs to be communicated very well, right? Because if you have a nice, clear document, but nobody understands it or nobody follows it, there's no point as well.
Yes.
And I think perhaps as a final question and looping it back to what I mentioned earlier, 70% of our participants today are at the very beginning of their careers in the Sarawak Civil Service. What advice would you give them for them in their careers in really starting to learn what strategy is and trying to implement strategy in their work?
Yeah, I'm a great advocate for the learning process, and the fact that they're on this webinar today is a great example of that. Go out and learn as much as you possibly can. Do a search on some of those models that I talked about today. And take the opportunity to lift the eyes, lift the vision a bit further, look a little further into the future. And I think that would be a really helpful way for people to kind of get a sense about what tomorrow will bring rather than just worrying about today. But learning is the answer to most things in organisations. And if we can all get better at that, then we'll be successful.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Dr. Sean. And I think perhaps as a very final last question, we also do have some of our directors and leaders of our state civil service. What is one advice would you give them when they're thinking about strategy and when they're thinking about, so many different methods that could be used?
Yeah. You stole my thunder a little bit a minute or two ago. I think it's the how you describe the strategy in a way that everybody in the organisation will understand, from the most junior person up to the most senior. We think it has to be a thick document. We think it has to be complex, but in reality, it doesn't need to be that way. If we work hard, we can bring it to a way that's easily understood, and that will dramatically increase the chances of people implementing that strategy if they understand it and they can get their heads around it, rather than it being a document that stays on the shelf that nobody really understands or lives and breathes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sean. And I think just to sort of summarize our learnings today from the webinar, you really shared with us, what exactly is the strategy, how some examples of strategy being used by American Airlines, by life insurance agencies, what could be the purpose of strategy, and the 6 different models that you really shared with us to give us a better understanding. Oh, we have a last minute question from the Miri Port Authority. What are the characteristics of better strategy?
I think the characteristics are clarity, simplicity, tight performance measures, detailed and thorough implementation. They would be the things for me. Without those things, you're always going to struggle.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely the perfect way to sum up our webinar today. And thank you for that question from Miri Port Authority. So thank you everyone for spending time with us today. We have 290 participants, and we've provided the link for the attendance and the webinar evaluation form. You can also download the slides that Dr. Sean has very kindly shared with us through the Google Drive. And I think if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to our team at the Leadership Institute. I think I may have forgotten to introduce myself. My name is Mildred Boone from the Leadership Institute, and this was a webinar by Dr. Sean Ridley of AIM. And thank you so much for your attendance today. Thank you, Dr. Sean.
Thank you, Mildred, and thank you, everyone. I hope you found it useful.
Yeah, thank you. I think right now, what Keegan will do is to share the QR code that everyone can take their attendance in, and please stay tuned to our next series of webinars, which will be held on the 15th of June. So thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe and have a great day. Thank you.